Hey, eyes and shine there, my friends and colleagues, and welcome to the I Give a Damn podcast, brought to you by Fluorescene Media, the sim company behind ODs on Facebook. Before we dive into the episode, I do want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, MacuHealth. If you've been following my content, then you know how deeply passionate I am about ocular health, as well as improving and protecting the eyesight of our patients in the clinic. MacuHealth is known for their triple carotenoid formula, lutein, zeaxanthin, and Meso-zeaxanthin, and whether you're concerned about age-related macular degeneration or just want to help your patients with the nutrients they need to stay sharp, MacuHealth has you covered. We'll talk about MacuHealth again a little bit later in the episode, but otherwise, let's get going. And today our special guest is Professor John Nolan, who specializes and does his research in macular carotenoids. We're talking lutein, zeaxanthin, and Meso-zeaxanthin. And I'm excited today for this conversation because this is personally a topic that I have had a deep interest in for a long time, because as eye care professionals in our education and in the research, we know a lot about the benefits of vitamins, supplementation, and dietary changes for preventing and even slowing down many major diseases. So to get an opportunity to deep dive into like the real research and somebody who's literally doing the research themselves is just an amazing opportunity. So without further ado, please hit those like and subscribe buttons, and let's jump into it with Professor John Nolan. So just to kind of start off, for all our viewers who've never had the pleasure of either seeing you give a lecture or read what you post on LinkedIn, which is kind of where I've secretly been stalking you for a few years, can you please fill us in on kind of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you. I'm John Nolan, and I'm a scientist. I'm nutritional biochemist, and I live in the Republic of Ireland. I work at a university, the Southeast Technological University. I'm married to Jane, and I have two lovely girls, Penny and Bee, and I love my job. Yeah, and my job is to do research, and remarkably, over 20 years ago now, my own PhD was about a topic which I didn't at that time have much knowledge on, and that was a disease called macular degeneration, which all your listeners and viewers will be familiar with. But my PhD question was to try and understand if there was a link between risk factors for the condition, macular degeneration, and nutrition of the eye. And at that time we were interested in pigments in the eye. We didn't even at that time know the specifics of the macular pigments. So the first research experiment I conducted as part of my PhD program basically identified that if you were to take people from the general population, free of retinal disease, healthy people, and categorize them based on their risk and their likelihood of developing macular degeneration, which we could do, of course, because that was well established. The risk factors, increasing age, genetics, family history, cigarette smoking being the three established risk factors. So in a very large sample, we were able to measure all those risk factors in people, but for the first time ever then measure nutrition of the eye in the form of the macular pigment, which we measured. And essentially, the reason why I'm sitting here now talking about this is we found a striking relationship even then between the pigments which I could measure in the back of the eye and those risk factors. In other words, decades before any individual was going to develop a disease, we could see that they had this deficiency in this pigment, which we believed at that time to be important, to be protective. And the science has just evolved exponentially since then.
And this is the macular pigment. Is this
Correct.
in the same kind of conversation of macular pigment, optical density?
Yeah, exactly. So macular pigment, so to speak about macular pigment, we have to talk about carotenoids. So what's a carotenoid? So carotenoids they're not vitamins or vitamins. They're not minerals. They're lipid-like molecules. They're plant-based pigments, and they're wonderful. And they're wonderful because we're actually here because of carotenoids. And what I mean by that is, if you look at photosynthesis in plants, it's enabled by the presence of the carotenoids in the plants. And there's over 700 carotenoids in nature. So anything that's natural and has color is likely to be from a carotenoid of sorts. And from a human health biochemistry perspective, this became very interesting to me because as you look through the carotenoids from the 700 in nature, a typical Western diet might contain 40 to 50, but in very, very low amounts. But then when you get into your biological system, your blood system, which is essentially the transporter of these, remember these are fat-soluble nutrients, and we should speak about that a little bit because that's important in the delivery of these nutritional pigments. From the 20 in our blood system, we see that the target tissues, which I was interested in, the retina and now the brain, selected just 3 carotenoids, lutein, zeaxanthin, and a very important carotenoid called Meso-zeaxanthin. So the composite of those, the collection of those carotenoids at the macula is seen as macular pigment, uniquely placed, localized and concentrated at the macula, not in the parafovea. And the research really has been to ask the question, well, what is it doing? Is it important? If it's important, how do we enrich it? If we enrich it, what does that mean for you and for me, or for patients with diseases like macular degeneration? And ultimately, all of those research questions formed research ideas, not just from my own research centre in Ireland, but from centres across the world who've been able to study these nutritional pigments. And, I suppose there's been some really important discoveries along that time, which maybe we can speak about today. But ultimately, I think to get to the conclusion, your industry in eye care and optometry, and particularly in the US, has been very successful in terms of implementing those scientific discoveries, those scientific findings to help patients in the clinic, which is what really matters. But as a scientist, I think that's probably the biggest reward anyone can get, to see that science that you're part of is actually being used in mainstream.
Well, congrats on that. I do want to rewind and just ask,
sure,
what time or when were you doing your PhD and doing this research, time frame wise?
Okay, so I did my PhD in 2001.
Okay.
And I defended my PhD thesis, my dissertation was in 2005. And that body of work was essentially on that kind of large sample from Ireland, where we, and as part of that first experiment, we had to figure out how to measure pigment in the eye, and we used a technique called heterochromatic flicker photometry, which is, as you know, a vision science technique. Essentially, we could measure the pigment by the fact that the pigment is yellow. It therefore absorbs blue light. And if you, from a vision perspective, if you have 2 lights at the same intensity to the observer, to the participant or the patient, the stimulus that they're looking at, would say if you have a green and a blue, if you have the same intensities, they look steady. So, in other words, if a patient had high macular pigment, in order to get to that steady state, you'd have to turn up the blue, essentially. So we're able to, and the beauty of that is by doing a measurement centrally where we have pigment, and in the periphery where we don't have pigment, which is crucially important to that technique, you can use the subject, the patient, as his or her own control. So you control for all the issues and challenges of doing business with, working with in the eye. So at that time it was very limited. We could measure, if you think of macular pigment as a kind of a mountain, and it's protective, and we'll talk about why it's protective maybe today, but it's a mountain. What we know classically is that at the macula, you have the peak of the mountain, and as you go across with eccentricity, it typically declines at about maybe 8-9 degrees of retinal eccentricity. It's optically undetectable. And that's actually amazing, isn't it? That it's so biologically programmed to be concentrated. It matches the distribution of the cones very, very well.
Right, it highlights how important our central vision is and how kind of prioritized.
Yeah, I mean, it's not there by mistake, okay? I mean, you and your industry know better than me, the macula, that 4% of the retina mediates over 90% of our vision. It's the tissue that gets sick when we have macular diseases and macular degeneration. And current standard of care in ophthalmology says let's wait until a retina is really sick and maybe has atrophy or maybe neovascularization where you need to do anti-VEGF therapy, and I call that health 2.0. But I think optometry is using, thankfully, health 3.0, which is there something we can do to get in front of this? And that's where nutrition, macular pigments, and antioxidants come into play, because we have to work with our patients differently than, because we're living longer, because and living longer is great, but it's not great for function if we can't change how we implement healthcare and medicine. And what we've seen scientifically has now been brilliantly validated by informed optometrists that, like you, spend time to study scientific discoveries and to try and implement them safely based on evidence-based science. And of course, there's so many challenges with that now, Joey, in terms of misinformation and industry input. And I feel sorry for optometrists, because I come to a lot of these shows and I see some of the education and some of the misinformation we need to work to kind of protect that. And there's some really good educators in our industry, and there's some people then that are maybe don't have all the information, so they're not communicating it correctly. And so we have to protect the eye care community, and the only way to protect the eye care community is to provide data and recommendations that are evidence-based from top scientific peer-reviewed experiments, essentially.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so honored that you came on to our show, because I think, especially in the realm of blue light, in the realm of retinal health, sometimes you'll have several PhDs claim all of this information. They have all this research and science to back it. And all it takes is for one specialist on the other side of the field to just say, like, well, I've been practicing eye care for 30 years and that's not real. And then it leaves the rest of us in the middle to be like, well, where do we go? What do we listen to? How do we practice? How do we implement that knowledge? I try to always read the research myself, and I think a lot of doctors are in that same boat, but at the same time we can't do everything, because right?
You just can't. I see how busy you are, clinic time, chair time, trying to get to use all the technologies that you now have, and it's efficiency around how an eye doctor does that is. So at the very least, we need to make sure you have the right information. I do say, and I was actually speaking at a conference only last week, and I was quite animated, as I can be in a positive way, but I was saying, come on guys, let's get excited about, vision again. Let's get excited about optics, but let's think about it not just at the front of the eye, not just with these, let's think about it from the optics that are inside the eye. And that's how I look. Macular pigment is an optical filter. These carotenoids, so we should speak about their antioxidant works, right? So they're...
Let's kind of dive into that, because I think basically doctors, I can tell you, we learn the AREDS studies.
Right.
We learn those very well. We're tested on them. I think most doctors should be able to rattle off the ingredients in AREDS 2 pretty well. But beyond that, I don't think anyone knows beyond really what lutein, zeaxanthin. Most doctors probably don't know how Meso-zeaxanthin is different, in that it comes from lutein.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it sounds like it maybe comes from zeaxanthin.
Yeah, it does, but it doesn't. Yeah, it sounds like it, but you're right to say it. So I can explain all of that very easily.
Yeah, please share with us your knowledge you have.
Okay,
from
thank you.
Years of study.
Thank you. So the first thing to say in terms of the macula, I always say it's a petri dish for a bad reaction to happen, this oxidative stress, and that's great because it just means that the macula is so busy being alive and doing what it's doing. So we have this high turnover of oxygen, high metabolism of oxygen. So the retina and the brain metabolizes more oxygen than any other tissue in the body. But there's a cost to that. And the cost of that is production of basically what we call free radicals. So they're essentially missing electrons. These are molecules that are missing electrons and they're unhappy. My grandmother used to call me a little radical because I was a nuisance. And these radicals are a nuisance in the back of the eye. but they're a fact that we're alive, and they're a fact of the cost of doing business with life, okay? But what the pigments do and what a carotenoid does is, because it has basically the chemical structure is C40H56O2. So that sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just, there's 3 parts to it. And because of all the hydrogens, it can essentially donate an electron. But the nice thing about a carotenoid is that when it donates an electron and stabilizes and neutralizes the whole situation, the carotenoid itself doesn't become reactive. It doesn't become unstable. And that's what makes it an antioxidant. No different to putting sunscreen on our skin. So from an antioxidant perspective, it's great that the carotenoids are localized in the area we need them, so they're present and they have that potential to deliver and exhibit the potential, the antioxidant benefits that it can give. Now, we've evolved to accumulate carotenoids from the second a mother feeds us. So when you look at colostrum and the beautiful yellow color, that's because of the fat-soluble carotenoids. Okay. And that's actually very important from a developing retina and from a developing brain, because the oxygen metabolism in a growing infant is significantly higher than you or me, than an adult. It's double, actually. Okay, because there's a lot going on. It's developing eyes, developing retina.
Sure, I didn't know that.
That's interesting, isn't it? So that's why, and we even see now some great work where we see, expecting mothers become highly deficient in carotenoids because they're giving all the good stuff to their baby. That's what the mother's doing. She's protecting her infant. But so to get back to kind of why carotenoids are good for us, the antioxidant piece is the first part that we should know about. Now, meso-zeaxanthin is crucially important in that, because if you measure the antioxidant capacity of the individual carotenoids, meso-zeaxanthin is superior to lutein, anti-zeaxanthin. It's just a better antioxidant because there's a slight difference in its chemical structure, which I'll speak about in a minute. But what's really interesting, Joey, is that when you connect the 3 carotenoids, there's this thing called biological synergy. So they help each other do the job they're supposed to do. So the cocktail of that protection, when you have the 3 carotenoids and meso-zeaxanthin present, is significantly better than if you had lutein or meso even at the same total concentration. And that's why I always promote the use of the 3 carotenoids from the first. And you hear some really crazy things that, meso-zeaxanthin is not good, it's non-dietary. I always say, well, the macula disagrees because it's the carotenoid that concentrates at the peak of that mountain. And so where does it come from? So that's the antioxidant piece. And we say, where does it come from? Right. So when typical American diet has very low amounts of these carotenoids. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is that there's not a lot of plant-based nutrition being consumed. And even for those who do, they're probably consuming about 1.5 to 2 milligrams per day. So when I say this, people say, are you saying, Professor Nolan, that we should forget about nutrition? No, I'm not saying that. Nutrition is the stable on which we can be healthy, and that's the primary place to go. But I'm just saying it's challenging because there's this thing called nutritional devolution, which is, if you think about carrots, for example, I think we could have 800 different variety of carrots potentially, but we've narrowed it down to 6 or 7 that are actually used throughout the world. So you're selecting crops and you're making it easy for crops to grow. What does that do to the plant? The plant says, it's easy to grow. I don't need the carotenoids. I started off by saying the carotenoids are crucially important for life because of photosynthesis. But if you make it very easy for a plant to grow, it's going to suppress the carotenoids that are in the plant. So we have this nutritional devolution, which we know about. So in other words, we're eating plant-based foods that have less of these good carotenoids.
Yeah, we've selected over many generations to cultivate, no, we want this carrot because it's sweeter. Yeah. Because it looks more appetizing to the eye, it sells better. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, we've kind of selected out. we've bred nutrient deficient food in some capacity.
Exactly right. And there's another reason then why it devolves is, we look at the link with CO2, and increase in CO2 causes carotenoids to decrease in these plants. So there's everything fighting against us. So I said about 2 milligrams. The data now shows us that we need to be at about 20 milligrams if we are to optimize our delivery system. System and those reservoirs, those fat. Remember, these carotenoids are not water-based. They're fat-soluble, so they're not water-soluble. So there's a lot of work. That's why if we were to change our diet and eat lots of carotenoids, you don't get instant results in the eye. Or if you take a supplement that has the carotenoids, you don't get instant results in the eye. Because what you have to do is you have to optimize your delivery system. Then your fatty target tissues, which we have a lot of, and the organs that are using these carotenoids have to get served with them. And we see, even if you're at 20 milligrams of carotenoid that contains the 3 carotenoids, you're looking at about, the blood will change after, the half-life is 10 days, which means you optimize your blood system in about 10 days. But the target tissues can take about 6 months to change, such as the macula.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of the research. It's, at 3 months and then again at 6 months are where you see the vast majority of the changes.
Absolutely. And Joey, it gets better at 12 months and it gets even better at 24 months. And that's why when I say to, doctors who are asking when we talk about this, it's like, this is a lifestyle change. This is not a silver bullet. This is like, if you want to get results in the fitness center, you got to not just sign up, you got to attend and you got to go and you got to repeat it and it's the same with this. And actually that tells us something else. It shows us and demonstrates very nicely how deficient we all are in these carotenoids. That's why all of our interventional experiments have been so successful. We've had a great opportunity to improve something that's changeable in a positive way. So, that's the antioxidant piece. The optical piece then is fascinating, right? And the optical benefits of having this pigment are linked to, and again in this industry, and we'll see at the vision shows that we go to lots of work with, spectacles and UV filters, and you look at cataract surgeons, standard we put in a UV filter, and that's because the job of the front of the eye, as you know, is to kind of remove the UV, otherwise our retinas wouldn't survive very long. But the magic of vision relates to the visible light spectrum and the ability of the lens to transmit that light to the retina and for us to use visible light wavelengths to give us the sensation of vision. But again, the cost of that is our friend blue light. So when we look, if you think of it as an energy line, UV is over here, high energy, sunburn, then we have this visible piece, but short wavelength on that is the blue, right? So about 460 nanometers blue. And that can do two things. It can cause photooxidative stress. So that means that basically that wavelength of light itself produces free radicals at the macula. Another problem for us to contend with. So that's photooxidative stress. But the other thing it does, and this is where I want optometrists to really be alert to the opportunity, is that, it causes visual confusion and visual disturbances. So how many patients have you seen in your chair that everything's healthy in the retina, cataracts are okay, but they're not happy, right? Driving, glare disabilities, photo stresses, all of these things that can be highly problematic to real-time visual function and visual experience. And what we've seen in a whole bunch of experiments now is that when you optimize the pigments, you can get real benefits in terms of visual function, visual ability for all patients. And that's why I think we need to turn around the concept of how we can use these nutrients. Yes, it's important for macular degeneration. Of course it is. And we'll speak about AREDS maybe in a bit, and the Crest trials as well maybe. But there's an opportunity for optometry to do something for their patients today where you can customize and optimize an internal filter, an internal lens that's working to enhance and protect your vision.
I know there's some publications, and maybe you can speak on this, about optical visual benefits for people when they're taking supplements, for example. Can you fill us in a little bit on some of those?
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a couple of really nice hypotheses put forward around, and I worked on some of those in our own experiments, the Crest trials. And so one of the issues that we believe, we know that blue light is scattered. So light scattering at the retina causes suboptimal visual output. So you look at one of the measures we see that's very important is contrast sensitivity, a measure of visual function that is totally underutilized in optometry as far as I'm concerned. For everything, for a disease patient, contrast sensitivity is the first measure of function to go. For a super performing patient that's baseball or whatever, their contrast sensitivity is our top end. So then the question is, well, okay, it's not the optical win that's going to enhance contrast sensitivity because it's not part of that visual pathway. So what's going on? So we believe that it's actually enhancing, by the carotenoids, enhancing the health of the macula. The macula is just doing its job better, and we're getting the visual benefits out. And then that connects into cognitive and brain functions and stuff, which we can talk about as well.
Right. You have this wealth of knowledge. So yeah, with what I've read with visual specifically, there's better, less problems with glare is certainly one of them. Contrast acuity is improved. I think I may be incorrect, but some form of like photosensitivity or light sensitivity.
100%, yeah, photosensitivity, and that's the ability. So the pigments are yellow, so they filter light at 460 nanometers. So you're reducing that phototoxicity to the macula, and then so how do you use that? Okay, it's good for you and for me, for the general population, but actually we have a series of projects now, some finished, some underway, in terms of even high-end sports performance. We're working with some teams for the Olympics in France. I have a PhD student working in Sports Singapore at the moment, and their top athletes now have been using the combination of the carotenoids, lutein, zeaxanthin, and meso-zeaxanthin. So in summary, what have we said so far? We have these pigments which are uniquely selected from nature, which are concentrated at the macula, so they're in the right location. They deliver exceptional antioxidant abilities, exceptional optical abilities. And then there's something else which we've just about to publish a paper on, another mechanism related to carotenoids, and it's in reducing inflammation.
And I've read a little bit about that. I haven't dove into the mechanisms. I don't know how much you can share if you haven't published it yet.
It's we're at the final stages of publication, so I can talk about it. This is interesting because it kind of moves away as well from kind of like the cumulative benefits of having these nutrients to maybe something that's more systemic as well. So and it also makes sense when we look at what we're seeing in patients with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way for many years. And so we did an experiment recently where we had given a carotenoid intervention. It was the triple 10-10-2, high meso, high lutein, and 2 milligrams of zeaxanthin as well. And these were general population people. They weren't people with particular diseases, but they had different risks of cardiometabolic disease just because people live differently and they have different levels of health. So again, we were able to categorize those. But what we found in that experiment, that 6 months following intervention compared to a placebo, was that the classic measures of inflammatory markers like TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, were significantly reduced at 6 months in the active group compared to the placebo. But the real new finding, which I'm fascinated with, relates to plaque build-up and heart attack. Essentially, you have a situation where your LDLs become oxidized. And so as part of normal life, and cholesterol, we have to deal with that. Cholesterol is really good, by the way. It's really important. People don't really understand cholesterol. Without cholesterol, we don't transport any of these nutrients. So that's important. But when the balance of healthiness kind of goes in the wrong direction, we can have too much LDL, and there can be a lot of oxidative stress. This is a trigger to everything. Oxidative stress is the beginning of everything that's bad, whether it's in the blood system or the eye or the brain. But anyway, we know that LDLs that get oxidized, the protective mechanism, the inflammatory response in the body is that the white blood cells send the cytokines to kind of clean things up, right? So you have these macrophages, which I call them Pac-Men. So they go and try and clean things up. And that's fine if you can deal with the load that it has to deal with. But in a very unhealthy situation, or in a patient that has suboptimal antioxidant ability, the Pac-Man gets clogged, and we call this a foam cell. And this happens, and it's basically stuck. So you have this oxidized LDL stuck within the cleaning system, and then this happens again, and then the body reacts even more. You get calcification, and that's what a plaque is.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, the point is, in this experiment, the biggest hit that we saw was a reduction in oxidized LDL just by carotenoid intervention. So now we're able to speak to a mechanism that's happened in the blood system that's likely benefiting everything that's good about health, to eye, brain.
Yeah, say that affects cardiovascular system, which that's a huge component of all blood pressure, stroke, dementia,
absolutely
diabetes. Right. There's a huge role in all of that.
Just look at dementia and billions of dollars spent on trying to get rid of plaques. That just doesn't make sense, because even if we get rid of the plaques, that doesn't mean you're going to fix the disease or help with the function connected to the disease and restore the neurons. So again, just like what we've done in the eye, it has to kind of come before that. And I don't know at the moment in terms of the anti-inflammatory benefits, whether it's lutein or meso or zeaxanthin. I suggest that it's the composite again. The meso-zeaxanthin piece is fascinating, because when we did our first experiment with meso-zeaxanthin, I was very reluctant, by the way, to work with. I was very comfortable working with lutein for maybe a decade. And when I was doing all of that research and we did a series of clinical trials, we were getting some very good results with lutein, but we were typically having a non-response rate of about 15 to 20%. And then we started to do some work with a group out of Mexico that were producing carotenoids, an organization called Industrial Organica. They basically originally produced carotenoids for the egg industry, because the hens were eating. This is where this came from.
That's I've learned through another doctor who informed me that they put lutein in chicken feed.
Correct.
To boost the yellow color of egg yolk. Because it helps sell egg yolks better, because it looks more appetizing.
That's right.
Where for people who have maybe chickens that graze just on the ground at home that don't get standard chicken feed, their eggs don't look as yellow and luscious like you see in commercials.
It depends on what they're eating.
Yeah.
We can even see it in butter. So if you look at Irish butter is lovely in yellow, whereas a lot of the US butter is white, and that's because the Irish cows are out in the fields eating grass, which has lutein, whereas the the barn fed cows here in the US, the butter is white. So
it's a lot. Imagine it's a lot of corn, soybeans, whatever they can to fatten the cow as fast as possible.
Yeah. Well, and if it's corn, if they're getting corn, there'll be lutein there, of course. But anyway, we got to work with, maybe 2000, I can't even remember now, it's a long time ago, maybe about 15 years ago, I started to work with meso-zeaxanthin, and we did what we call an exploratory study. So it wasn't like a high-end study, it wasn't a double-blind, it was just exploratory to see. I wanted to see if meso even got into the blood system, because we measure carotenoids in the blood system on a system called HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography. So it's just a chromatography science, it's a separation science. So we even had to develop the protocol and the methodology to work with that carotenoid. And long story short, in those early experiments, we saw two things. We saw that every patient responded in their blood and in their macular pigment, but the rate at which they were responding was significantly better. And then I went to Augusta, Georgia. I did my Fulbright around 2006, I think, and I worked with a vision scientist there, Professor Jim Stringham, and an amazing scientist in our field, Professor Max Snodderly, just a brilliant scientist, professor. So I went and worked under Max for a while, and we started, OCT had just kind of come out around that time, so we were looking at the architecture of the eye and the profile of macular pigment. So I wanted to evolve the measurement beyond just that single point. So we developed a protocol to measure the entire spatial profile. And we found that there was a percentage of the people that we were measuring didn't have their mountain of pigment, they had a volcano. And Max in the beginning thought that was bad measurements, and made us repeat the experiment, and we got the same answer. So then I went back to Ireland following my Fulbright scholarship, and we did a major program on that because I felt it was really interesting to keep this research going. And we measured over 1,000 people in Ireland, and we saw about 15% of them had this volcano. So then around the same time, we saw from the anatomy studies that if you were to chop up the eye and look at the locations, if you were to pucker out where the pigments are, you saw that meso-zeaxanthin seemed to be concentrated centrally and more peripheral as lutein. And this has since been validated by Paul Bernstein out of Utah, where he's been able to image that exact same data, and it validates it very well. So then I hypothesized that, well, actually, maybe they're just missing meso-zeaxanthin. So where does that come from? So you're right, Joey, to say that based on the chemical structure, C40H56O2, so this is basically a long molecule, and at the end of this we have this hydroxyl group, which is where the oxygen is basically. But to convert lutein into meso-zeaxanthin, all that needs to happen is a double bond, and the hydroxyl group moves one place. Okay, so it's a stereoisomer. And that we see that this is likely to happen a lot and normally and commonly in the eye, because we're not eating a lot of meso, if any. We're eating very low amounts of meso, probably trace amounts.
Because we don't see it in nature too much.
Not too much. We see it in like fish skin, and we see it in certain types of seafoods.
I think shrimp to some degree.
Yeah, and it's very, very low. So we don't see meso in the blood typically. So that means we're not getting it in diet, but we see it really concentrated in the macula.
So the macula is in itself
making meso because it needs it.
Yeah.
So the idea is that however, here's what was really interesting. So we had a PhD student who did his whole PhD on this, actually, profiling out and looking at the different architectural profiles. And what he found was he actually replicated my original dissertation with looking at risk factors. And what he saw was that these volcanoes, the people that were in society with a dips in their macular pigment, were the same people at high risk of macular degeneration that I saw. So then the question was, wow, are they just not able to convert lutein? Is that why they're walking around? So how do you answer that question? Well, you give them meso and see if their volcanoes become mountains. And lo and behold, it did. So when we get the carotenoids that we got for those experiments came from this group in Mexico, Industrial Organica. So the science begins in the marigold field. I always say that, because when they're able to extract the carotenoids from the marigold petals, essentially, and majority of lutein, as they extract it, this is a process called saponification, which is basically food grade cooking. Okay, and as you do that, the meso-zeaxanthin has been generated from the plant. So you're taking it from the plant, so it all comes part of the package as you saponify. And we call it isomerization. So with saponification, which is basically cooking the plant, you get an isomerization, which is that the double bond of lutein moves, and now we've meso. And meso is just a magic carotenoid because it's a better antioxidant. It orientates itself differently, we believe, in the retina as well. So it's not there by mistake. It's fixing an evolutionary problem, I believe. And again, to the point of getting in front of diseases and visual function and everything we've learned there, we've evolved to have this pigment because we had to kind of fix maybe something that the eye wasn't very good at, dealing with that visible light.
I want to take a quick break just to remind you about today's sponsor, MacuHealth. If you are listening to this, then you probably care about eye health just as much as I do. MacuHealth offers a line of incredible supplements that's formulated around published science. MacuHealth is known for featuring the three most important carotenoids for your macula: lutein, zeaxanthin, and meso-zeaxanthin. Whether you're managing age-related macular degeneration or simply looking to offer your patients a high-quality supplement you can trust, MacuHealth has your back. Now, back to the episode. I'm curious because lutein, we know, deposits highly in the eye,
yes,
or at least functions highly in the eye, but also in the brain to some degree, right? Because we can ask a little bit about cognition if you want to talk on that.
Yeah, sure.
But what about meso-zeaxanthin? If lutein is making naturally meso-zeaxanthin in the eye, do we know if it has any other relationship in the body, or is that just kind of of relation possibly to your more recent research with inflammation, these effect on plaques, macrophages?
So great question. I mean, the answer to all of this is that it's very difficult to measure the specific carotenoids. Okay, so Liz Johnson out of Tufts University has done some great work with her scientists quantifying brain carotenoid, and we see beta-cryptoxanthin, and we see lutein, as you say, as the carotenoid that they've been able to measure. But I don't, and they did look for meso-zeaxanthin and reported that they didn't see meso in the brain. But I've seen meso in the brain of animal models, of hen models. So when I feed hens, who, by the way, when they're on carotenoids, are much healthier hens, and they produce more eggs and better eggs and so on. But that's interesting. But the point is, these carotenoids are taken up in the brain. But I haven't measured it myself in human brains. It's an experiment that I will do.
I was going to say, that's a whole different process, right?
It's a whole different process.
Who's going to donate part of their brain for this study?
Well, in fairness to Liz and the work that they did, she ran a centenarian study, which was amazing, and those wonderful patients donated their brains. And that was a really important piece of research and takes us into the whole cognitive space and neurodegenerative disease space, because when Liz Johnson and her team were saying, actually, if I measure macular pigment, which she did, and if I then measure brain carotenoid concentration, what she found is that the patients in that study who had high macular pigment scores had higher brain carotenoid concentration scores. So now we have a biomarker of brain nutrition by simply looking into the eye. Around that time, I was working on a major program in Ireland called the TILDA study, the Irish Longitudinal Study of Aging. And we worked with over 5,000 patients. Sorry, they weren't patients, they were participants. They were randomly selected participants. We call this an observational study. And it was part of us getting ready for aging in Ireland. It was supported by the government. 30 million euros was spent on this program. And I was very fortunate to get to work on the eye piece of that. So I was measuring macular pigment in all of these people, and I was imaging their eyes. And there was another scientist who was working on the program, but she was working on cognitive function measures, so reaction time, memory, attention, and we were working in parallel. And I published some papers with my colleagues from that work, and we showed some really nice findings around diet and education and society and how that all determines your carotenoid score. But Joanne Feeney, who was working on a program as well, had all this rich and valuable cognitive function data. So we kind of said, let's put it together. And what we saw in this large observational study is that out of the 5,000 people, when you categorize them, those at the highest carotenoid intake had significantly better cognitive abilities than those with less. This is real powerful data for a sample that size. And I said, wow. And then looking at Liz Johnson's work, saying when we knew that the macular pigments were indicators of what's going on in the brain. And I was working with another scientist at that time, Dr. Alan Howard from the Howard Foundation UK. He's passionate about nutrition and great supporter of the research we do in Waterford, Ireland. We decided to start to look at patients with Alzheimer's disease, which was a really mammoth task, I have to say, Joey, because, when we do people don't realize this, when we talk about a publication, it can be 3 years of just protocol writing. Ethics alone, IRB can take 2 years. So it's just such a commitment to even, and understandably, to work with a vulnerable population group of Alzheimer's. It took a long time. I had great support from doctors I work with, Professor Rina Mulcahy and other doctors from Ireland in geriatrician medicine, who came with me on the journey to try and figure out how we could work with those patients. And what we found very quickly was, yes, patients with Alzheimer's disease were highly deficient in carotenoids. So then the question was, well, can we fix it? Because patients with Alzheimer's disease don't eat a lot of food. So maybe it wasn't a big surprise. But what was fascinating was that their vision was totally flattened, really bad, contrast sensitivity. And then as Rena said to me, Dr. Mulcahy was like, wow, if they're not getting the information in, the whole thing just becomes very compromised very quickly. So we ran some single blind experiments again before, when we'd always do that before we go to the double blind, and we ended up using a combination of the 10-10-2 carotenoid intervention with omega-3, high DHA omega, which is great because the amount of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA in the brain, and we saw really remarkable results when we combined the carotenoids with the omega-3 fatty acids. And we published that work, which was very small sample, and then we went on to do a larger study called the REMILE trial, which was our classic double-blind placebo control, which we had to run during the pandemic. But the conclusion from that experiment was that, patients with established mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, when given carotenoids plus omega-3 fatty acids, had significant improvements in their quality of life, as reported by their primary care. And these are things, what I didn't realize with dementia and Alzheimer's, and some of your listeners who I'm sure have loved ones who maybe suffer with this terrible disease, will see that the person loses themselves. And one of the things to change significantly is their mood. They become very agitated. It's very sad to see. And again, I'm not saying that nutrition or carotenoids are a cure or anything of sorts. They're absolutely not. But they certainly should be used in the co-management of all of these diseases. Going back to our Crest experiments, the discovery of the inclusion of Meso-zeaxanthin and the importance of that allowed me to go and win a major grant in Europe, the European Research Council. So it's equivalent to the NIH here in the US, right?
Well, congrats on that.
Thank you. Yeah.
And like you said, you put a lot of effort, and it takes time to figure out just the ethics, let alone the design of a study, and then to actually get it going.
it was 10 years of and remember as well, Joey, we had to deal with an evolution of technology, thankfully, because HPLCs got better, OCTs got better, how we measure vision got easier and more sensitive. So we had this kind of amazing time where technology in our research industry just got so good, and then the people that we got to work with, which was multidisciplinary, were so good, and we put all of that together, and I went and we won the lottery grant essentially to do Crest, and part of that methodology was the product I picked, which was the MacuHealth, the 10-10-2 formula, and this was a government-funded experiment. I chose to use that formula. Why wouldn't I? Because it was the formula that was giving me by far the best results. So that was part of the discovery, part of the technology. And we did 2 experiments. One was in the healthy population, people with low pigment to begin with, but no retinal disease. And essentially we improved many measures of visual function, contrast sensitivity at 6 cycles per degree, which you'll remember from Osley and Sloan being contrast sensitivity. They published work saying that the predictor of real life visual experience is contrast sensitivity. And that's why when you even look at patients who are in the chair and are saying to you, doctor, I'm not happy with my vision, and you're saying, well, your acuities are fine, we're going to let things ripen up before we go out. If you measure their contrast, you'll see that's why they're unhappy in the chair. Then do cataract surgery and see what happens.
Right.
Their vision acuities get better, of course they do, but contrast sensitivity correlates with how they feel.
Right. That's how many patients we see. I mean, every single time they're like, wow, things are brighter, things are more vibrant, colors are vibrant. And I think that directly, they're so happy after cataract surgery.
Yeah.
And even, LASIK, most people finish LASIK, they sit up, they're like, wow, I can read the clock.
Yeah.
But we all still know contrast acuity is affected by a lot of refractive surgery procedures like that. And so I'll have patients who later are like frustrated, I don't see well at night, I don't feel I don't feel safe driving as much anymore. And there's glare issues with pupil size that we have to consider. Of course. But we know through research, contrast acuity is affected by those procedures.
And every optometry practice has has contrast sensitivity tests, but we haven't figured out how to turn these on and to find time to use them. That's the problem. And I'm not, I suppose I am critical of that. I want it to happen because I think it'll help the doctor, and I think ultimately it'll help the patient.
I think it'll help our conversations.
Yeah, sure.
It'll take some time, as all things do, but I think it would help kind of get the public to start thinking and understanding eyesight, and it'll help our conversations better about the importance of taking of diet supplementation, of how everything's connected between your lifestyle, how not only your eyes function, but then how that is tied to your brain.
And the good thing now, I mean, for many years I've been very blessed to work with optometrists, and I mean that with all seriousness, because the science that we've been part of is no good if it doesn't get used. And the people that have been brave enough and good enough to use this are the optometrists. So, and what we have to do, Joey, in my view, is I think there's a statistic that it takes 20 years for scientific discovery to eventually end up in the clinic. We have to shorten that time, and that's happening. So luckily now as well for optometry, and we see this in kind of microcosms, we can now measure carotenoids in the clinic, right? Which, you know, for me, I'll be very clear about this. We were very lucky now. We use an imaging technique to measure carotenoids in a research environment. So we use a spectralis OCT, which uses dual wavelength autofluorescence. Same principle as the flicker, but it's an image, so it's an objective full measurement of that map. So I dilate, and essentially we excite the lipofuscin, and you do that again with a blue and a green laser, and then the same principle. When you use the blue, there's this kind of suppressed area of excitation because the light's not getting to the lipofuscin, and then you can digitally subtract one from the other, and we've published a series of papers on that. It's not in the clinic.
As I say, like, I wish it was.
Yeah, it should be. It should be, because it's, you know, once you all have these systems, and again, it just, you know, it's back to kind of regulatory and everything that goes with that. It's approved for research, and
those are going to be my next questions. But at all these trade shows, at every single OCT booth, I'm going to be asking, "Hey, can you do this?
Yeah.
Hey, can you do this? Oh no, you can't. Okay, when can you get it?"
Yeah, right now, it's the Heidelberg group that do it. Their system does it, and I have some of those that we use very successfully. But you know, one of the things that I think eye doctors, you know, first thing, I compliment every and any eye doctor that has tried to have the conversation about nutrition and carotenoids in their clinic. And over the years, there's been multiple of devices used or promoted for use, but it's not easy, Joey, to measure macular pigment. And it's certainly not easy with subjective flicker tests that have been promoted, and the reproducibility of those highly questionable in that environment, right? And
I've questioned some of that myself too. It's just like, you know, the lighting of the room.
Yeah.
You know, you have a patient who's got a cataract, and it's based on age, but we know that sometimes doesn't line up.
No.
And then you always question, like, well, is it how many degrees eccentric from the macula?
Yeah, all of these things.
Yeah.
And when we do it in a research environment, we have a lot of time. So I don't use psychophysics flicker photometry anymore. My vision science friends are kind of disappointed with that because they just love these visual systems. But you know, the other thing you have to do is customize it for the patient. You know, all the points you make, and some of these kind of clinic friendly devices kind of compromise that, and the net result is you're getting output data that's probably not accurate. But the good news is we can now measure carotenoids in the skin.
I was going to ask about that because I think for, you know, a decade ago I saw a lot of MPOD machines, and we use an MPOD machine at our clinic. Although I think it's becoming outdated. But now if we go to trade shows, I see a lot of these transdermal testing for carotenoids. And I haven't read much in the research of it, so I don't know if you can speak on their validity.
Absolutely. So there's two main types, and the scientist behind it is Werner Gerleman, and Paul Bernstein was involved. Originally it was used in the eye, they used Raman. which is basically, you can use that in the eye, and they've now used Raman scatter. So you basically, again, excite the molecules, the carotenoid molecules, and they give off an emission, and you can capture that. And they've done amazing work to that. It wasn't very successful in the eye because the challenges of pupil size and dilation and all the issues. So it was used in a series of research studies, but for the skin they were able to validate it and correlate it. And there's systems out there where you can use scanners, you put your hand on it and it gives you a composite. So it's not individualizing any of the carotenoids, it's measuring total skin carotenoids, which is perfectly fine, because if you, for example, take a carotenoid supplement, we know that lutein, zeaxanthin, meso goes to the skin as well. So you're going to change that, so your score is going to change. So it's going to be a very good screener or predictor of what's going on everywhere else. And we've been able to cross-correlate that. There's another one, and the one we now use is called the life meter, which basically is really cool because it's a spectrophotometer. It's exactly right. So the carotenoids in the skin absorb light. So we can measure the absorption spectrum of them in the skin using this calibrated system. So essentially, remember the old big spectrophotometers? Now it's like down to something. and that's something, the life meter is something that I think is really easy to calibrate. You calibrate it daily. You do basically 3 measurements on the patient. They're highly reproducible. And if a patient wants to change something based on the doctor's prescription, you'll see that it correlates really, really well with them. So it's what I would recommend right now if the eye doctor wants to really do business with carotenoids, for sure.
Now, to kind of even step really back to kind of earlier, we talked about just AREDS, the AREDS studies. Those are huge landmark studies, I would say, changed the face of probably eye care, but even before my time, because I finished my schooling in 2015. And that was right when AREDS 2 had been published, right about that time. So we know about those effects on slowing the progression of macular degeneration at intermediate stages and advanced stages. But that's a huge thing. But we also know that, again, macular pigment optical density, for example, people who have higher macular pigments, they're less associated in the research with developing macular degeneration. Can you just, in your own words and insights, kind of just share your perspective on those findings of their ARED studies in relation to macular degeneration?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. Because I think it's really important. And look, as a scientist, I grew up in a world where the starting point was that medical ophthalmology said nothing about nutrition. I have this whole thing about health 2.0 and health 3.0 and health 1.0. So health 1.0, we live longer because we stop infection. We stop people dying from an infection. That's great. Health 2.0, current standard of care, is current medicine, which is basically licensed treatments for diseases, but the doctor, he or she, will implement a pharmaceutical. Typically, you look at macular degeneration, so the treatment for macular degeneration is do nothing until it's so bad that I inject you with anti-VEGF therapy. So moving to health 3.0 will be getting in front of that. The reason why I'm saying that is the ophthalmologist, to begin with, would never make a recommendation to a patient because they're terrified of making the wrong recommendation or something that maybe there'll be a lawsuit against, or is the evidence accepted within the organization of eye care, and that's where AREDS changed the game. But because it was a proper longitudinal interventional study, but not without its weaknesses in terms of study design. Like if we look at AREDS 2, for example, which was, they got rid of beta-carotene and put in lutein and zeaxanthin. Unfortunately, Meso didn't get into that experiment. They didn't measure macular pigment. They didn't measure visual function. So it was a morphology. It was a disease experiment. And as you say, the high-end conclusion from AREDS 2, which is very old now, is for patients with intermediate AMD, there may be a benefit to doing these cocktail of antioxidants plus lutein and zeaxanthin.
Right, slow the progression down by 25% over the course of 5 years.
That was the original one, right? And what people don't realize is at the AREDS 2 experiment, there was no true placebo. Everyone was given the original standard of care. So the research question was, well, actually, if we throw lutein and zeaxanthin on top of that, do we get an extra benefit? I thought that we wouldn't, because we didn't have a clean page to do the experiment on. But remarkably, we did. Now, if you look at the 10-year follow-on from AREDS 2, actually, the data shows that the benefits extend beyond that intermediate. Of course they do. It's like saying sunscreen only works if you have a certain type of sunburn. It just doesn't make sense. The whole biologically plausible rationale whereby we should use carotenoids is in a preventative way. It's not about fixing the disease when it's present. It's about this health 3.0 getting in front of it. I mean, it just so. But that's what kind of, and I see it with optometry. The bravest optometrists that I know get a difficult time in medical ophthalmology because they might have invested the time to study the research and understand the importance of supplements and the role for supplements, and then make a recommendation, and then the doctor will just take them off AREDS 2. Now, here's an issue I have as well with the one thing I'll say about all of these supplements is the first thing you want to know, well, which formula do you think works best and why? And we've kind of talked about that today. The second question relates to the stability and the quality of that supplement, because my hope for the future is that doctors will not be as laissez-faire about a recommendation, because they're kind of a little bit still uncomfortable with saying, this is what I want you to do. Your patient wants you to tell them what to do.
Right. You want to make it easy for the patient.
You have to make it easy for the patient.
Don't make them guess at it.
Yeah, because it's too hard for them, right?
And I think the issue, the reality is, while we're in school, I think schools can't be so specific about a brand sort of thing. If it was a pharmaceutical where we didn't have any potential choices or anything, it would make it a lot, that would make it easy for not only education purposes, but it would make it easy for our decision, right? Yeah. So I think there's conflicts there, so schools have to remain neutral. And so it does leave it up to us. If we're going to start making these recommendations, we have to put in that work, or rely on education that we get. But we have to pursue that, right? Because some doctors may not be interested. They may just only go to glaucoma lectures and things like that. So I think that's why that is. If you could, because I kind of dabbled in a little bit of it. But there are these questions when it comes to these, I would say, the supplements, vitamins, stability, bioavailability.
Yeah. Oh, two great questions.
Yeah. Can you talk about?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. The first thing I'll say, in case I forget it, going back to the AREDS recommendation, I just came from a Walmart on my way, not a CVS pharmacy on my way here, and I could see all the AREDS. There's 80 milligrams of zinc. That's way too much zinc to be recommended to a patient. Absolutely no question. In fact, the AREDS study itself showed no difference between high zinc and low zinc. So you can ask yourself the question, why is it still in there? It would be illegal in Europe to give a patient 80 milligrams of zinc. So my conclusion on the AREDS is science has moved on. It was a really important study because it demonstrated the role for that in, as you say, in reducing the progression. So, but I would do low zinc and I would include meso. That's kind of the punchline.
We're just out of curiosity, because we do have some brands on the market that advertise no zinc, right? Yeah. But then there are some brands that have maybe 15 milligrams of zinc. Is there a range? Because there's also some
benefits.
Other debates about that we should do genetic testing to find out if somebody should be on zinc or not.
I think that overcomplicates everything for a busy eye doctor. I think you should just keep the zinc levels low. My go-to is a triple carotenoid intervention. When you're in the conversation of age-related macular degeneration based on the AREDS, I understand that optometrists and ophthalmologists will want to make a recommendation consistent with that study. So I would do about 20-25 milligrams of zinc max. And I'm not interested in genetic testing connected to that. And you can look at the publications and the debates. I think keep it safe for everyone is the simplicity, and use the most optimized combination of nutrients. For me, the champions are the carotenoids. I have to say one thing though. You know, when we look at the AREDS experiment, I know with certainty that the formulation that was used, paid for by the US taxpayer, the formulation that was tested in that experiment is not the same, not even the same carotenoids that were sourced. They were sourced from a different, and this is really important, Joey, because the science, as I said, begins in the marigold field. And as you extract carotenoids, the purity of which you extract them, how they're formulated, keeping them stable, these are great questions, and bioavailable. So I think we should speak about stability and then maybe bioavailability. And just for the avoidance of any doubt, so maybe people say, oh, he's the Macular guy. Let's understand why I am. It's the formula I used in our experiment, and the intellectual property. I don't own any intellectual property. I have no ownership or intellectual property. It's licensed from our university to the organizations that successfully used that. But it's with certainty the formulation that I would recommend, and it's with certainty the formulation that I believe an eye doctor should recommend, MacuHealth, because it has the efficacy bit. Does it get into the system? Does it optimize the target tissues? Does it change function? And also, the stability bit is really important, because about 70% of supplements that are in, maybe even more, in the pharmacies, the claimed active carotenoid material will not match its label claim once we measure. And that's why we set up a program called Supplement Certified, which is a campus, university campus initiative, campus company, which I'm part of, for full disclosure. And we set this up because we believe, based on our scientific experiments, that there is a real opportunity to improve quality testing within the industry. So if you, as a doctor, have gone to the time of being educated on this, and you want to make a recommendation, you and your patient should have the comfort that that formulation is delivering the micronutrients that are claimed on the label. And that's where Supplement Certified comes in. So I think there's efficacy and there's stability. And we have many companies, competing companies, that are using, thankfully, the Supplement Certified quality. So basically, every time there's a product produced, a lot produced, they get sent, and this is an ISO approved process now, sent to the laboratory, and we will quantify it at source and over the entire shelf life. And when carotenoids are formulated correctly, when they have oils, so omega oils or classic oils that are used, it'll stop them oxidizing. Because when you take carotenoids out of plants, Joey, you're deesterifying them. You're getting rid of the esters. So you're going back to that pure carotenoid molecule, the C40H56O2 molecule. And that's lovely, because that's what we want to get into the system. And that leads us on lovely to bioavailability.
I know, just to kind of clarify, because that's something that I did learn, and maybe science has changed a little bit. But like you were saying, it's fat soluble.
Yes.
And there are some supplements of carotenoids that are in kind of gel capsules. They're not just like a powder.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there are some supplements that are kind of like a chewable tablet of some way. Does that make any difference?
Yes, massive. So carotenoids in powders are dead. Because if carotenoids are deesterified, and they're probably originally put into the powder, they'll be oxidized within 30 days. And this is why Supplement Certified is important, because we need to be able to shine a light on that. So you need to have them in an oil, a soft gel oil, to protect them. The chewables and all of these, again, we see degradation very quickly. We see that they don't meet label claim. So I would go to a soft gel that has the carotenoids present.
What about gummies? You see some
They're
gummies
going to
on the
be,
market.
yeah, I see them all over the place. And, for kids, I'm doing a lot of work in schools at the moment. We have this program called the Lunchbox Project, where we're going in, measuring carotenoids in schools, and we're taking photographs of the kids' lunch, and we're trying to show them that the kids that are, my own kids included, if they're doing better with their carotenoid foods, their carrots, their corn, that they're going to have a better score in their skin. We're using the life meter for that.
That's cool.
Gummies, there's a lot more work needs to be done. and the stability of them is a problem. We've actually started to develop functional foods now. So we just finished a program called Vista Milk, which is where we actually were able to add carotenoids to yogurts, right? So now when our kids are having yogurts in school, that they're going to have lots of carotenoids as part of that. So these are all publications that are about to come out. So
this is all fantastic. So thank you for doing all of this work.
No, it's great. Yeah, because I love it. And I think it's important I wrote a white paper recently called From the Cradle to the Dance Floor, because that's where we need to take the opportunity that these carotenoids provide. But I'm glad you brought up bioavailability, because unlike the water soluble, like vitamin C, for example, which gets into your system very quickly, fat soluble carotenoids, they have a long journey to go on. And not to get too sciencey, but when you consume them, they have to find their way through the intestinal wall and the lymph system. To do that, they have to form a micelle. Now, they can form micelle from, we produce these surfactants within the stomach, bile, for example, and it helps with kind of, essentially, I'll go back to my Pac-Man analogy again. It gets wrapped up and it goes on its journey, because without that micellular formalization, they won't get into the blood system and they won't end up in their target tissues. They'll come out. Carotenoids, you don't see carotenoids in urine because they're fat soluble, and we'll see them in the other direction. If you were to measure that, it's an experiment I don't want to do. Some people have, of course, but thankfully we did one program. There was a medical doctor, Dr. Marina Green, that's working with me in Waterford. Her whole PhD was on enhancing the bioavailability, and that's where we used what we call a micromicelle formula. Exact same carotenoids, but they're just facilitated by providing the surfactants that are required to enhance the development of the transporters. And also it does one other thing, because they're in what we call a diacetate, which is the C40H56O2 molecule, but just with a small diacetate as part of that, and it's still the natural molecule, they don't crystallize. So if you were to take a microscope and look at purified carotenoids, like soldiers in an army, they line up, okay, and they'll all become a crystal. And crystals are not highly bioavailable. They'll go through, it'll be difficult for the stomach to use them. But by providing it in the micromicelle, which is now what they've done in the Macular formula, we get a far superior response in the blood system and at the target tissue as well. And even at 6 months, we see this. So the science is evolving the whole time, and that's why eye care has to move beyond AREDS. Will there be another AREDS? I'm speaking to them at the moment. They're interested. It'll probably, if it happens, it'll probably take a long time. For me, the AREDS looked at morphology, looked at disease. What we do that's different with much smaller samples is we look at function. So our primary outcome measure is not disease, because we could never power a study, even with the millions of euros. We spent about 9 million euros on competitive research funds to get to where we are now. That's not enough to do a kind of, and I often hear, particularly at the kind of medical conferences, the classic default from an ophthalmologist will be, it's a small study, when are you going to do a proper one? And that's kind of, it's not a very helpful statement, because actually we don't need to do 5,000 people to show the results. You can show anything with numbers, statistically. The statistical effect.
Yeah, if the power is good enough.
Yeah, exactly. you can see like really weak relationships becoming statistically significant. The question is it clinically significant? And that's what we've done with the Crest studies. We've demonstrated function output measures that have that clinical value. So,
and I think two other, for again our viewers, listeners, two other more recent publications that I got my attention. One was on retinal, on wet AMD.
Okay.
And they used supplementation of, if I'm not incorrect, it was just zeaxanthin.
Okay.
But it was a higher dose of zeaxanthin for patients getting injections, and they found that patients who were receiving this antioxidant, the supplement, their needed repeated treatments of injections was reduced by like 30% or something like that. That one caught my mind just the last year or so, and then a newer publication was on cognition and children's vision specifically. That just recently came.
I think that's from Paul Bernstein's lab. Yeah,
I believe so. Yeah. And that I think for children, that was even, because you're a parent.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, wow, this is not just for older senior adults with vision decline. It's like, no, this impacts us our entire life.
Yeah.
And now I believe lutein, zeaxanthin, at least lutein is in a lot of children's formulas.
Yeah. Abbott Nutrition have done a lot of work back in the day with children's formula. You know, I've measured colostrum. I joke my wife is still looking for Penny's last sample. It ended up in the lab. But yeah, you see the amount of carotenoids that are there. It's amazing. So nature's telling us to do this straight away. You're absolutely right. Going back to the wet AMD one, I always say as well, sometimes people say, oh, if it's wet AMD, is it too late? Well, we've two eyes, and you're right. You know, we have data ourselves that shows that visual function outputs in parallel with treatment are going to be enhanced and improved. And remember, with anti-VEGF therapy, you're not fixing the disease. You're cleaning up kind of the cost of the disease in terms of all these blood vessels, but the disease is still there. And that's why, you know, there has to be something better and something earlier. And I would never look at nutrition as a replacement for any standard of care treatment. It has to be used in the co-management or in a preventative way.
I think just to kind of land our plane, because this has already been this is an amazing episode, and we've got like a good amount of time on this, but I think just to kind of wrap it up for all of our doctors and everyone listening in, what do you think kind of the big message when we are talking to our patients? Like, for example, I always do advocate for my patients to first eat like whole quality foods. I want them to eat like a heart healthy diet, lots of fruits and veggies. I always tell them, you know, eat, like even young kids, I'm like, eat your fruits and veggies. These are so important for the eyes. But like you said at the beginning, even if people are eating amounts of a lot of veggies, we maybe don't absorb a whole lot of these key nutrients. But in your own words, what do you think would be the most important kind of things for us to be mentioning to our patients about carotenoids, beginning supplementation, considering it? What are your thoughts?
I think it would. Thank you, Joey. I think it's listen to your patient and be brave in your recommendation. Your patient there's certain things that we do in life that just work well. You know, folic acid, toothpaste, the things that we don't get from eating plant-based foods or from just being healthy, that we should do because they're working. And I put carotenoids right in there. I think the totality of the evidence now allows the eye doctor prescribe. And there's 100 reasons why a patient may not want to. It mightn't be right for them, but there's 100 reasons why the patient may want to. And if a patient goes to an eye doctor, not just for this, to get the best possible outcome for their vision, an informed discussion and recommendation, finalize all this by saying, make a recommendation that has a scientific evidence base and a quality stability program, and your patient will thank you for it.
Well, thank you so much for being here, for all of the just wealth of knowledge that you shared with us.
Pleasure.
I know we could probably keep on going for another hour or more, so maybe we'll plan on having you on again at another time. But again, thank you so much for just being here. This has been an amazing episode. So
my pleasure, and keep up the great work.
So that was our episode for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are somebody who is deeply passionate about our profession or gives a damn about a specific topic that may be affecting our industry in some way, please let us know either in the comment section over on YouTube or in the review section. Leave us a solid review on whatever your favorite podcasting platform is, and let us know if there is a person in our industry that you would love to hear from, or perhaps a specific topic that you would like to hear in more of a deeper conversation on this podcast. Otherwise, thank you so much again for listening in. I hope you have a fantastic day, and we'll see you in the next episode.